Hello and welcome to In the Channel from channelbuzz.ca, bringing news and information to the Canadian IT channel for the last 16 years. I'm Robert Dutt, editor of channelbuzz.ca, your host for the show. My guest today is Tim Coach, Chief Evangelist at Cynomi, a vCISO platform purpose-built for MSPs and MSSPs. Tim brings an unusually grounded perspective to the space. He's an engineer by training who spent nearly 2 decades building, running, and consulting on managed service practices before landing at Cynomi after seeing the platform firsthand and recognizing it could have solved one of his biggest operational headaches as an MSP owner, the CISO bottleneck, the point at which growth stalls because the security function can't scale without adding expensive headcount. That personal history shapes everything he thinks about TPRM, third-party risk management, which is increasingly being talked about as the next major revenue category for MSPs after human cyber risk. Today we're talking about what building a TPRM practice actually looks like, why cyber insurance has quietly flipped the MSP value equation, and why the right starting point isn't a vendor questionnaire at all. Let's get right into it, my chat with Tim Coach. Tim, thanks for taking the time. I appreciate it.
No, I absolutely love to be on. Thanks so much for having me and for having Cynomi on your webinars. We're always happy to do these things to educate the community.
You've spent a long time in and around the MSP community. How did you end up at Cynomi specifically, and what was it about the opportunity around TPRM that kind of pulled you in?
So TPRM was eventually in the process. So what got me in the community was, so I'm an engineer by education and trade, meaning I went to college to be I think it was called network communications back in those days, right? So I went and did that. So basically I'm a network guy, right? So I always point at the programming guy and say, it's your fault. And then the programming guy's like, no, it's the network's fault. So I did that for a large scale nationwide company, for many years. And then I fired my MSP and the owner was like, well, if you're so good, why don't you come over here and run this? And I was like, okay. And I got over there, it took me about 24 hours to realize I didn't have a clue what was going on at this place that had so much chaos. But I knew through process and procedure and a military background, like I could get it under control, and ended up having a business partner from that. And we spent about 20 years rebuilding MSPs and consulting with MSPs. And then about 5 years ago, I just needed something different, right? Kids were a little bit older, seeing what else was out there for my career and where I could go, and talked to a couple of mentors in the space. I'm sure if I mention their names, everybody's going to know them. And they were like, no, you should come over and do this. So I went in for a Canadian company, grew them quite a bit in the first year, then jumped over to an Australian company, grew them, and then had gone back to consulting for a short time. And David from Cynomi was recommended to consult with me. So we were kind of consulting back and forth, and he was like, why don't you come on? And I'm like, yeah, I'm not really interested in selling a widget, especially a security widget, right? Because there's so many great widgets. There's already so many great personalities in this security space that I'm like, probably not my jam. And he's like, no, let's jump on and look at it. And he showed me what Cynomi did. And then I was blown away. And the reason why I was blown away is because probably my most successful MSP, is we hit a stopping point in our growth. And the reason why was our CISO, right? Now this was CISO before CISO was a cool term, right? But he was our bottleneck. He was extremely inefficient. And it's not because he as a person was, it's because the way that he had to work was. Right? 80 pages of Excel spreadsheets and hours and hours and hours on top of questionnaires. So when I first seen Cynomi, the thing that I seen was, man, here's a way for me that I could have doubled the size of my company with the same staff, with the same CISO, right? So that is what really inspired me to jump on board with Cynomi, was seeing the dashboard and having that personal pain attached to the lack of growth and the bottleneck in the security systems we had, right? Now, with the release of TPRM, that excites me because in my old MSP days, I had a ton of banks, right? And banks are SOC 2 all over the place, right? And part of SOC 2 is you got to have TPRM, right? You've got to be responsible for everybody. So now all of a sudden we're cranked out this platform that allows the MSP or MSSP or ITSP or whatever SP you want to throw in front of those, right? To go in and easily manage those vendors and understand where your clients are in their security posture and the vendors they're using, right? In that security posture. So that's where TPRM became like really that next step, because having that security before it was security was cool kind of thing. And I still don't think security is really that cool probably, but it's just experiencing that pain and seeing what Cynomi's doing and then adding TPRM. And then we'll talk about some more stuff that we've added. It's just continuing to remind me of how much more I could have grown several companies using Cynomi's solution.
You may not feel it's cool, but it's certainly foundational security.
It is. And that's the problem, right? But that's why we're still talking about security, is because nobody knows how to talk business. They all talk widgets, bits and bobs, and here's this cool firewall and MDR and XDR. But you know what your clients don't care about? The widgets. They care about being secure. And until we can breach that, until Cynomi brings along something that says, hey, here's an easy way to get to the data and the details that you need. And here's a CISO level intelligence where the MSP can go and say, okay, here's how I translate into the business technology that's going to help this doctor's office, that's going to help this manufacturing company, that's going to help this X, Y, or Z, insert whatever vertical you want, right? That's the reason why I think we're still talking about security so much, is we just don't know how to translate it into business speech.
Well, let's do a little bit of that with TPRM itself. Let's take a step back maybe and look at it from the viewpoint of an MSP who's heard the acronym TPRM but hasn't really dug in yet. When we're talking about third-party risk management, what are we actually talking about? What's the problem? And to your point of your experience there, what was it about it that kind of let you unlock growth for that organization you were with at the time?
So when we talk about that, what a lot of people have to understand is, and I try to say this where it's very easy to understand, we should be managing security first. Compliance becomes a default. When I say that, what I mean is that you need to have a baseline, right? Whether it's CIS or CE Plus or CMMC2, or it's one of the financial ones or HIPAA or whatever it is. You need to have a baseline that you're actively managing your security to.
Yeah.
And then in the process of that baseline, it will get you to where you're compliant. Now, in most security features now, what we're seeing is that the certification or the auditor or the insurance underwriter are wanting to see that the solutions and the partners that we have are just as secure as we are. I was at Canales in Barcelona last year, and Rob was talking, and for the first time, the statement he made that just blew me away. For the first time ever, we've seen insurance underwriters deny the SMB because they're connected to an MSP, and the MSP is what they consider their risk. So now we went from being, the most important people on the planet, essential workers, to we're risk. And on top of that, that's been a lot of our foot in the doors over the last decade, was we can help you with your insurance policies. So where TPRM or third-party risk management comes into play is now what the frameworks and the insurance underwriters are wanting to see is it's not just you that's secure, but it's everyone that you're using that is secure. Problem comes again is, how do you manage that? Like back in my day, it was, I got to call this vendor up, and then I got to find the right person, the vendor to talk to. And then I got to say, hey, can you provide me evidence of your SOC 2 compliancy? And then they say, I'm not the person. And then they send you another person. You eventually end up with legal. And then you have to sign some kind of NDA. And then they'll give you the SOC 2 compliancy. Now what we're seeing is people are sharing that information a little bit more, but you still have to have a central place to manage that. So when the auditors or someone who certifies you or the insurance broker wants an actual place to look at, you can simply say, here's where it is and here's what it's held. That's the reason why the TPRM module was so important as we're moving forward, because, we've done a couple on our, if you're unaware, we do a community call every Wednesday at noon Eastern time. And we've had a gentleman on a couple of times that specifically talks about TPRM. And then he's wrote a few books and he's like, oh, this, like, he's sounding the alarms and they're not bad alarms. It's coming. But like the rest of SMBs, the MSP or ITSP or MSSP, I'll just use ITSP from now, is trying to drag them in to where they need to be, and they're kicking and screaming. So once you have those modules, once you make it easy on the MSP, which makes it easy on the SMB, right? You finally get to a point where you have an easy way to manage it, an easy way to show someone and prove to them that you're taking those measures.
Supply chain attacks have certainly been a theme in the channel for a while now, between Kaseya, SolarWinds, MoveIt, all of these things. But TPRM as a formal managed service element feels newer than that. You touch on sort of the insurance side of things. That sounds like it's a big driver. What else changed to make it go from kind of a theoretical concern to something that, MSPs can really build a practice around?
Well, okay. So for me, I firmly believe that you cannot be a business partner without knowing how your partner makes money and how you have to protect them. I can't protect them if I don't know what they're using and I'm not managing it to some level, right? It's the whole adage of, if two people are managing something, then nobody's managing it, right? So this is a step. TPRM is really a step for the ITSP to take that next level business relationship and start ensuring that everyone that their partners are using are protected. Because what's going to happen is the same thing that always happens. It don't matter who it is. It doesn't matter if you have it hard coded in the contract, I'm not responsible for X. When something happens, that SMB comes at the ITSP and says, but I thought you were managing this. No, we go over in your contract at least once a year, which is a whole nother conversation about, we don't have enough conversations about our contracts and our relationships. But it's still, hey, ITSP, why aren't you taking care of this?
Right.
So now when you're talking business, when you're saying, I'm going to protect how you're going to work over the next quarter after quarter after quarter, year after year, you're taking it to a point where you're protecting their entire environment and not just your little piece. And that's when you move to a business relationship, not a sales reoccurring. Every time I talk to you, I'm upselling, I'm cross-selling, right? I mean, and we've done it to ourselves, right? But it's like talking to an insurance agent. I live in Oklahoma and they're trying to sell me hurricane insurance. Cross-sell, upsell, baby. But that's not what we should be doing as business partners. And that's why I think TPRM has really come into play, because it allows us to have a fully understanding of their environment and to make sure that everything is protected, or at least the things that are not are known to everybody.
So I see the point here for TPRM as sort of a risk reducer for the MSP, for the MSP's customer. But you guys have also described it as a next major revenue category, sort of after human cyber risk. Can you walk me through that, and what does the recurring revenue model actually look like? What makes it sticky for the client relationship? I think that's what you're getting to with the last point.
Yeah. So, look, everything leads to MRR, right? This is business, right? But where you have to start out is the project. You have to understand where they are in their posture or their journey to know where to manage them. If our partners don't do things for free, right? The SMB doesn't do things for free. Unless you're actually working for a not-for-profit, you're not a not-for-profit. So where we're saying this is a revenue generator, this is something that actively has to be managed. I talk about this with security all the time. I can't throw a server at it. I can't throw a firewall at it. I can't throw a solution at it and say that I am secure, because you're not. The best scenario I've ever heard of security is the kind of the Swiss cheese diagram, right? So you take a block of Swiss cheese and there's holes and you can stick, a fork or a chopstick or something so far through this hole, right? And that's kind of like security is, right? That hole, when you got a block of Swiss cheese, those holes are pretty deep. But if you slice that block and you turn every slice 90 degrees, now all of a sudden is you still got the hole. It's just not as vulnerable or as deep as it was before. That's where TPRM is coming into play. You have to actively manage this. There is no stopgap fix.
So what does a typical engagement look like? Especially early on. If an MSP is starting from zero with a client, where does the work begin? And what do MSPs often find is a surprise about the scope of it as they get into it and as they go further with customers?
Yeah, I think everything begins with an engagement, and that's usually some type of an assessment. Right now, I argue all the time, especially with the tools that Cynomi has as a solution, and I truly believe this and would use this if I was an MSP. We can now use CE Plus or CI or something that's self-regulating as a baseline and add a couple hours to our initial assessments to have that security assessment. So we all do those assessments up front to understand what we're getting into, right? Or what we need to fix before we really get in there, right? And then when you get into security, it's like, okay, what's next? And then you start looking at TPRM. Now, TPRM also comes with something else I think is extremely important, which is a business impact analysis. If you don't know how your client makes money, and you don't know, and I'm not talking about look, what does your client do? They make dog food. Do they? Or is that just their end product, right? When I was an MSP, I had a metal manufacturer, and essentially what they did is they just cut metal and stamped it, right? If you ask their CFO what your business is, he would say making pallets. I make more on pallets than I make on stamping some of this stuff, right? But the idea is if you don't go and you don't walk through and you don't understand how they're working, and that's where TPRM comes in, right? I used an example with a presentation yesterday. Years ago, I was working with a manufacturer, walked through, hey, what does this machine do? Well, that machine runs the software that completes our product. Okay, why is it not plugged into the network? Well, it's a 98 machine. Okay, why are you running a 98 machine? Because it's running a decade-old German software that costs $10 million to replace.
Right.
Okay, how many of these machines do you have? Well, just that one. So if you're not walking through and really understanding how they make money and how it works, then you don't really know where the risks are. And that's what the TPRM is doing for you. That's when you engage. Don't get me wrong. I would love to do all this out of the gate, right? I would love to sell a project that says, I'm going to do an assessment. It's going to have a security assessment. We're going to come in and we're going to get your security posture correct towards the baseline. We're going to make sure we have a business impact analysis that includes TPRM and BCP and IR and all this stuff. But it just doesn't happen. You have to phase it. So once you understand the BIA and what they're doing, now you understand, hey, there's all this software and this stuff that they're doing over here that we need to include in their security posture because those are vulnerabilities, right? I mean, it's just, we talk about all the time. It's why would I hack the individual if I can hack the software that manages all the individuals, right? So if you go after an MSP, why would I try to hack a specific account? But if I hack the MSP's RMM tool, I got access to everybody. So same thing here. If you go into a business and you don't understand what they're working with in the softwares and where the postures, the security postures of the software, you at least need to be able to tell them this is a risk, right? Because the way that they talk is revenue, cost, and risk, right? TPRM is a risk if it's not being managed. And that's a huge vulnerability in our space. And I think that's the reason why we're seeing so much attention on it as of late. I mean, some of us have been doing it for decades because it was just part of what we did. Maybe it wasn't as cool as TPRM, right? I think back in the day, we called it vendor management. right? But that's where it's evolving to, because now we have an entire risk profile we have to look at, and we're missing a huge chunk of that if we don't understand what they're using in that environment and what the risk associated with that is.
We've talked a lot on the show about that whole MSP tools as the attack surface thing, and that's, RMM agents, remote access tools, backup platforms, whatever it may be, where the MSP is supposed to be managing the client's vendor risk, but the MSP in their own tool chain is someone else's third-party risk. I guess TPRM can help to square that circle, but how should MSPs be thinking about that side of things?
I think they need to be thinking about it from, once again, it should be part of your business impact analysis. What are they using? What's providing the security holes? And how do you have a better overall management of it? And there's a project in there, but look, every project should lead on MRR, period. It still has to be managed, right? Everybody was super scared back in the day when Exchange servers went away and we went, what are we going to do? Where's all the profit going to go? There's still an entire environment that he's managed. And let's be honest. Yeah, we made revenue on hardware. It wasn't great in the old days, probably even worse now. But managing the environment and the ongoing pieces of that environment are what's critical to it. And that's why TPRM is so critical, because it's a huge security gap in the overall security posture of your clients.
So pushing on that even a little bit further, TPRM platforms themselves are pulling in a pretty comprehensive map of an organization's vendor ecosystem, the gaps, what's been remediated, basically a full state of the landscape. If one of those platforms gets compromised, that's not just a breach, that's like a pretty rich list of where to go. How do you think about
So what if you, so think about this. What if you're a CNC factory, right? And your job is you build the molds to put out X. And the software that sits on the server has all the schematics fully built out. What happens if that software gets hacked?
Yeah.
Then all of a sudden you lose all the schematics to put in the CNC machine to say, hey, I need to cut this new piece so I can put out a whole bunch of Heinz ketchup bottles, right? Now we're getting into supply chain, because if I'm hacking you early enough in the process, I'm not just affecting you there, but I'm affecting you way down the line, right? So I know people kind of think about things a little bit different, but that's a security risk. If your server or your location that holds the software and you've got 20, $200,000 CNC machines in there, 5-axis CNC machines. I may have a little bit of experience with this. And you're not protecting that software, and you don't understand from a TPRM perspective what the vulnerabilities are there, or at least to the network, or what that means. That's an ongoing risk. You always have to manage that.
Well, sitting where you guys are at, how do you think about sort of the security side of running a TPRM solution, and what should MSPs be asking you and your peers in the space about that side of things?
Efficiency, right? How efficient? Like I know I'll probably get in trouble for saying this, but I'm gonna say it anyways. We've stupid-proofed the first few levels. We've built it out for you, right? And what that means is I can't get this across. There's so many AI conversations, and unfortunately I just said AI, which we've avoided it pretty good for, about the last half hour, but AI is meant to enhance the human. It's a tool. It's a solution, right? So what we've done is we've said, okay, here, let's build out this platform. Let's throw in some AI agents and some AI intelligence to make it easier. So it's no longer, because, right, like, when we talk about money and how you make money, if I'm throwing one of the highest cost assets in my company at labor, but I can take that down to say like a tier 2, now I'm making more money because I'm using less labor, which increases my margins. And I really think that's where Cynomi has come into play, is we've taken all of these super complex security pieces and just continue to make them easier for a lower level talent, not the lower level from a CISO or a CISSP, right? Those are pretty expensive assets. and we've moved it down to someone else that can do the majority of that work because we built the CISO intelligence into it, but we're not replacing the CISO because even though I got a tier 2 ripping and running and doing all this work and doing the TPRM access and running things down, it still needs to go to that security expert within your company for final approval, or, they may have piece of information. I used to work with a company that made a widget for an Apache helicopter. They had no public facing anything. So if I'm a tier 2 and I run into my CISO and I say, oh my God, we have absolutely no web security in place, anything for this client. Maybe the CISO is the only one that knows, hey, because the kind of thing that they do, they don't have a public facing appearance. So let's just knock that down the list. So you still need the CISO, but you need to bring the labor levels down so you can make more margin and help more of your staff be more efficient. Because the more your staff becomes efficient, the less of a bottleneck your CISO is. And once again, I'm picking on them a little bit, saying they're inefficient, but they're inefficient because of how they have to work. Previously, with Cynomi, we've made them obviously more efficient. We've opened their bandwidth to do things they want. I mean, God forbid someone gets to do what they want to do for a profession. But I think that's where it's really important is that we've opened it up for other people to do some of the work so that you can expand your company without having to add another 6-figure salary.
For Canadians listening, there's some very specific regulatory drivers on the table right now that are driving a lot of interest around this whole getting a feel for the overall security stance of the ecosystem writ large. OSFI's guideline, is it E21, I think, that comes in September 2026, compliance deadline for federally regulated financial institutions. Can you talk a little bit about the role that you see TPRM playing in responding to regulation and to helping partners be compliant with these kinds of issues?
I can, because, and this goes back again, what we're seeing is the insurance underwriters, the auditors, the people that are in charge of these regulations, right? They're the ones setting the standard, and we're having to meet this standard. The problem is the industry isn't to a point where it can easily meet a TPRM standard. So what's going to happen is, whether it's, Canada or the US or the UK or EMEA as a whole, it'll probably be a bit like HIPAA. They'll throw something out there and they'll be like, oh, we all want to do this. And then a couple years after that, they'll give it teeth, right? But they're really going to be the ones that start going to push down. And we're going to see, like, look, we all know that insurance will try every way they can to get out of paying a policy.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's their job is to make money too, right? They're not a non-for-profit. Now, we don't have to get into the whole debate about insurance in Canada versus insurance in the US. But the point is that if they're pushing it, we have to do it. And what I used to love, and I think a lot of people haven't flipped that mindset yet. If you watch what the auditors are doing, right? They're typically leading the charge a couple of years ahead of time. And if you stop looking at an auditor like they're your mortal enemy, they're here to show everything that I'm doing wrong, and you start having those conversations about them, and you start looking at what they're picking at, and TPRM is coming into play there, you can really be ahead of the game, especially with your more technically advanced companies. Right? The ones that want to be the head of the game, the ones that are trying to protect themselves, right? The auditors are always a good leading indicator, but it's always going to come down to government that's going to force the policy. And then it's going to come down to insurance that's going to try to get out of the enforcement of the policy, right?
So if I'm an MSP listening to this and thinking, okay, this is interesting, I can see how this would benefit my business. What's the realistic or easiest starting point? Not the sort of ideal end state, but the first practical move for an MSP who's starting to build into this space.
I think your first starting point is the BIA, the business impact analysis. You have to know, I think statistics show that something like so every SMB has 3 to 5 critical processes that make 80% of their revenue.
Mhm.
Do they know what that is? Right? Probably not, right? They make dog food, right? They take care of kids, whatever it is, right? But they don't know actually how they make money, right? I got an old client that happened to be a buddy to, he's in retirement stuff, right? So you go in there and you ask him how he makes money because you're thinking he's investing your stocks and your portfolio, you're doing all this. And it's not. He's actually making money by selling you the policy. And then the insurance company that he sold the policy for is who pays him.
Mhm.
Right? So if you're not starting off that business impact analysis, if you're not starting off understanding how your clients make money, then you don't really know what solutions they're using. Right? So starting off that conversation about who's your critical software outside of us? Who maintains that? Do we have a relationship with them? Like, does that lead to your money? I think the other thing I love to loop around this is what's their cost of downtime per hour? Right? I mean, I know a lot of people don't think about that, but it's, if you're a doctor's office and your systems go down for 4 hours, and that's 4 hours that you have 8 providers. For those that don't know, you call a doctor a provider in their practice. You don't call them a doctor, right? I'm speaking their language, not ours.
Mhm.
What did that cost that company where they couldn't produce half a day, right? You take a manufacturing firm, pallet machine goes down. Literally, the only thing this thing does is hold the product that the rest of the assembly line is making. But if that pallet machine goes down, how much money per hour are you not producing? And if you don't know that, then you don't understand how to properly service your client. You're still worried about the bits and bobs instead of worrying about, revenue, cost, and risk.
A little bit of a future-looking question to wrap up here. Where do you see this category going over the next couple of years? For an MSP, for a solution provider, is this something that's going to be a standalone practice, or is it something kind of folds into a broader VCISO or governance kind of offering or framework?
I think it's going to be both. I think what you're going to see is you're going to see people that just have it already embedded into their solutions. Like here's my silver, my gold, and my platinum packages, right? And it's depending on what you get is what's already embedded in there. And then I do think that there's people that's just going to buy it as a one-off solution. And it's going to be a way for them to say, here's a way for maybe a lesser amount than a full VCISO as a service kind of thing would do, but I'm still protecting them. I can buy this one piece because I've got some other pieces and I'm not quite to the full security game yet, but I can get this one piece where I can at least evaluate and be part of that. So the more advanced companies will have it baked into their solutions, right? But once again, growth and maturity, right? It will be a single one-off as well. So people can, people that are starting out can say, okay, I need to look at this piece because that's a critical piece to the overall security posture of my client.
Fascinating. It's an interesting area of technology and to your greater point, business. I appreciate your taking the time to share some thoughts on how service providers can get involved.
No, thanks for having me on. I always appreciate it.
There you have it, Tim Coach from Cynomi. I'd like to thank Tim for taking the time today. He's been around the MSP space long enough that when he points at something and says it's the next thing, it's probably worth listening. A few things I want to make sure land from this conversation. The first is the business impact analysis as the true starting point. Before you think about vendor questionnaires or risk scoring tools, you need to understand how your client actually generates revenue, which processes drive the majority of the business, and which vendors are load-bearing in that equation. That's not a security conversation, that's a business conversation. And that's the shift that moves an MSP from tool vendor to genuine business partner. The second is the insurance signal. When underwriters start denying SMB coverage not because of something the SMB did, but because they're connected to an MSP, that's a warning and an opportunity in the same breath. MSPs who can demonstrate they're actively managing their client's third-party risk have a new and better story to tell. And the frame to carry with you, security first, compliance becomes a default. build a practice to the right security baseline, and the compliance checkboxes largely take care of themselves. The channelbuzz.ca podcast is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, most of the major podcast directories. If you're finding value here, ratings and review are always appreciated. They help other people in the Canadian IT channel find the show. Until next time, I'm Robert Dutt for channelbuzz.ca, and I'll see you in the channel.